Hey everyone, it's me, Aaron, and this is Comic Class, the show on this channel where we just geek out about comic books, and today is a very important episode of Comic Class because there's some big, major breaking stories in the world of comics that we need to discuss. What's that? I'm actually being informed that nothing of any importance is happening in the comic book world right now. Okay, cool. Not even anything like X-Men related? No? Alright, cool. Well, in that case, there was a story that came out over a month ago at this point that was kind of a big deal, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it here. It was something that I really did want to discuss. In fact, we even talked about the first issue of it, and I said we will definitely return to this when it is all said and done. But then some other big stories were happening at the time, so we didn't really get a chance to cover it. But hey man, if nothing is happening right now, what better time to actually finally talk about Spider-Man Life Story. Now, this was a storyline written by Chip Zdarsky and drawn by Mark Bagley, two very big creators out there, one of whom has had a long history working on Spider-Man books, and one of whom just recently did a Spider-Man series, but it was considered by many people to be a massive success, especially the final issue of it, which ended up winning an Eisner for the best single issue of the entire year, and yeah, it kinda deserved it. I said it when that issue came out, that was one of the best single issues of a Spider-Man book I have ever read. It was fantastic. So this is a dream team to tackle a premise like this. The premise behind this series being that it is basically going to retell the entire story of Spider-Man, except with him aging in real time. So, you know, the Spider-Man who was created back in the 60s, but because we're not allowed to have a Spider-Man who grows past a certain point, they have to keep taking everything that happens to him and just kind of like scrunching it all together just a little bit more, and then shifting it over by another decade, and then by another decade. Just keep pushing that right on up the time stream, because, you know, can't like have a Spider-Man get old and retire. I mean, then we need new characters out there, and we're not going to ever have something like that happen. No. I'm kidding, there are new characters out there, and they are great and wonderful, and I will talk about them in just a moment. But yeah, I have made no secret about this. I love comics, but a problem that I have had with Marvel and DC for a long time now is that we eventually get to that point where if characters are not allowed to grow and progress and develop, then what's really the point? If you have to constantly keep saying everything back to zero, keep undoing all the big changes that you do, and not allowing characters to get older, then yeah, eventually you get to a point where it doesn't really feel like any of this stuff matters all that much because it's not going to have any kind of long-lasting effect on them. When I started reading comics, the thing that I really enjoyed about Marvel and DC is that, oh my goodness, these are the adventures of characters over the course of several decades, all building, and as we see them affect these characters, and we see how that pushes them further down their own personal journeys. And then one more day happened. And then a whole bunch of other things happened to other non-Spider-Man characters that basically just kept going, yeah, reset all that stuff. Just nope, just reset. Yep, can't do that. So now I still really love comics, but I love mostly like indie books, and when it comes to Marvel and DC, I enjoy the more unique stuff out there. I do enjoy the new books a lot more, or I enjoy the books that can take the older characters and actually do something really fresh with them, like the X-Men. Are we sure we can't talk about that this week? No? No, we can't. Okay. Alright, cool. Anyway, back to Spider-Man. So yes, this is going to be a story that was going to be taking Spider-Man, my own personal favorite superhero of all time, and doing with him what I've wanted to see people do with Marvel and DC characters for a long time now. So yeah, I was very excited about this. I was practically sold on this thing from just the description alone, and I have seen so many people praising this book. I've seen so many people saying this deserves all the awards. They won an Eisner right here just with this single series. Bam, discussion over with. These guys, they wrapped up best book of the entire year. One of the best Spider-Man things I have read in my entire life. I have seen all this praise coming from fans, from critics, from the entire industry itself. I think it's just okay. Pause awkwardly. Yeah, I think it was fine. When we talked about issue number 1, I said this basically kind of just feels like a regular Spider-Man issue, except every now and again they stop to talk about Vietnam, which was another thing that I found kind of impressive about this book, is that they were going to try and tie the real world events in more with the comic books themselves. But then again, like if you go back and actually read some of those older comics from those time periods, a lot of the stuff that they addressed in this series are things that were actually addressed in the comics themselves. Comics used to talk a lot more about actual real-world things going on at that exact time. So a lot of stuff that I was reading here, like, oh, Spider-Man is talking about Vietnam, I was like, there's a couple of books out there that did talk about Vietnam back there during that time. You know, when we get into the 80s, they were talking about the Cold War. I was like, yeah, comics never kind of shied away from the Cold War. I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about more and going into a little bit more details than we used to see in the old comics, but this isn't really anything that new and refreshing. It wasn't until we got to the 2000s that it kind of hit me, because in the 2000s, they actually did stop at one moment to talk about 9/11, but they didn't actually refer to it as 9/11. They didn't like refer to any details on that. They just said, yeah, I saw on the news someone that looked like you helping to clean up after everything that happened. I saw them there in the rubble helping to clean up. That's really all they talked about. And all I could stop and think was, that's weird that we mentioned the Cold War, we mentioned Vietnam, we even get into like a lot of the political arguments that people had about Vietnam, but we're not allowed to mention 9/11. And I found that really interesting, because so many comics at the time did specifically mention 9/11, including Spider-Man, who had an entire issue specifically focusing on the event itself. So that was kind of the point when we got to the 2000s, when I started looking at all the real world events that they were tying into Spider-Man's story, and I went, okay, in the beginning, it really seemed like that was going to matter. But now that you're just kind of like very briefly taking a major thing that happened, one of the biggest events in American history, and just kind of going, yeah, okay, like one page there to just say it happened, and that's it. That was kind of the moment when I went, oh, it doesn't actually really matter to his overall story. None of the things that you were talking about happening in the real world as being an influence on Spider-Man's life, none of them really matter. So that element of this story is gone. So what's left of this story? Well, what is left of this story is that it is basically going to try and retell the major events in Spider-Man's life, but now framing it around the idea that, yeah, Spider-Man actually will grow, and we're going to see these things not be something that comes up and then a few years later in the comics, which is the equivalent of a couple months later for Spider-Man, it's all resolved. No, when it's brought up here, it's now something that affects him for a decade. It's like, okay, that actually is kind of interesting. And at the end of issue number 1, I looked at it, as I said, and I said, this is just basically a regular Spider-Man book, but the real world elements that you're introducing in here, it's kind of interesting. Because the big thing that Spider-Man was contemplating in there was, should he actually go and fight in Vietnam? And he even talked to Captain America about that. Captain America said, listen, I just woke up, I was fighting World War II, and now I'm here, and now my country is calling me to go and fight again, and I'm gonna do it, because that's what I do. But you're needed in other places, so if you feel like you're needed here, then I understand. You do what you know you need to do. And then that issue ends with Captain America in Vietnam turning on the American soldiers. And I looked at that and I just went, oh, that's going to be a big thing. That's going to be, oh man, this story just took a massive turn, and I cannot wait to see how different this storyline is going to get. We never see any of that. Like that big, giant, massive cliffhanger that we got there, it's just kind of mentioned in the background every now and again. It's like, yeah, Iron Man, Captain America, they're still fighting. Yeah, we're still trying to hunt down Captain America. Okay. Does that have like any effect on the story? No, not really. Not until we got to the 2000s and we got to Civil War, Iron Man versus Captain America. And then we basically just got Iron Man and Captain America. We got the thing that we know from the comics, but now there's like a little bit of an extra dimension in there, because now we knew that for decades, Iron Man had been working for the United States government, while Captain America has spent decades fighting the United States government. So okay, so there was a little bit of extra weight there, but this isn't Captain America's life story. This isn't Iron Man's life story. It's Spider-Man's life story. So rather than it being this really big deal affecting Spider-Man, it was more of just Spider-Man going, oh wow, yeah, these two people I know, they've got a history. Anyway, back to all the stuff happening in my life. So yeah, these really big changes that were going to be happening to these characters based on the fact that we were getting deeper into real world issues, and we were seeing how those real world issues were tying to these characters over the course of decades, I don't really feel like it mattered to Spider-Man at all. So what we were really left with in this series, to me, was basically just someone, man, this is gonna sound really bad, and I apologize for this. It felt more to me like someone just going, here's all the knowledge I have of Spider-Man. Isn't that cool? Because yes, there were many things that happened in this series that I looked at and went, yeah, those are the exact things that happened from the comics. And I have to say, I was actually really impressed at moments in here where they were able to take things that happened in the comics and then they went, all right, this is something that took years to happen in the comics. Let's boil all that stuff down to one single issue. Like, for example, in the 90s, they had to do the Clone Saga. Clone Saga is one of the most jumbled, crazy messes that's ever been written by Marvel Comics. They were able to take all that, simplify it into one issue, and they hit all the beats in there. They hit the moment of Ben Reilly returns, and then when Ben Reilly returns, Spider-Man has to go up to him, and they have a discussion about who's the real Spider-Man, and then it turns out Ben Reilly was the real Spider-Man this whole time, but then Peter Parker finds out that no, he was the real Spider-Man the whole time, but then they have to uncover that it was Norman Osborn who was doing this the whole time. They were able to include all those elements in this story, and it fit very well in there. And I was indeed very impressed by that. I had to stop and just applaud, just like, yes, okay, awesome, great, I can't believe that you actually did that, that was amazing. But then there's other times in here where it really just kind of feels like I was listening to, now that's what I call Spider-Man. Like, for example, the 80s issue, which to me was actually, no, it was not the low point. The low point was the 2000s one with Moreland in there, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the 80s one, they had to fit in there Kraven's Last Hunt, the superhero Secret Wars, the actual Cold War happening in the real world, and then the Venom symbiote. They had to fit all those things together, and it really just kind of felt like someone was coming in here and mentioning, yeah, these things happen. All of them in there. It felt like a whole bunch of ideas for things that could have been fleshed out that weren't. For example, there's a moment in there in which they talk about how during the Marvel Superhero Secret Wars, that's a jumble sentence, but during the Marvel Superhero Secret Wars, when all the characters got picked up and taken away to the Beyonders world in order to do battle with each other, the world was now left without these heroes for a little bit of time. And the Russian superheroes, they weren't chosen, they weren't picked up and taken away. So the Russian government now looked over at America during the Cold War and went, wow, their biggest defenders are gone. We can totally come in there and just roll all over the place. So yeah, they mention about how Russia tried to bomb America and the Vision had to stop it, but the Vision couldn't totally stop it, so there was still a town that was wiped off the map. And now Vision was just standing there at all times, just frozen because he couldn't believe what he just witnessed. Holy cow, that is a big, deep thing. I wonder how that's going to come back into play at some point. Doesn't at all, never mentioned again. Yeah, it's kind of a shame. It's kind of a shame because that is a cool idea, but it's never really mentioned again. But the biggest problem with that 80s issue is, to me, the biggest problem with this entire series overall. It's that yes, there are a lot of really big, impressive ideas in this storyline. Not just in the 80s issue, but in every single issue. But we do not get the time to actually focus on any of them. Because they have to take an entire decade and cram it into one issue, and you might hear that and think, okay, so like, you know, some pages are in like 1971, then you turn a couple pages, 1972, then turn a couple of pages, 1973. No, it's basically just one snapshot of a moment in that decade. It is one story taking place at one specific time in that decade, meaning there is like 9.5 years worth of story that is happening to Peter Parker off panel. And that seems like some of the most interesting stuff in here. For example, when the 1960s issue ends, it ends with Gwen Stacy discovering that Spider-Man is Peter Parker, and ends with Captain America turning on the United States government, and ends with Norman Osborn going off to jail, but he now knows who Spider-Man is, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, what's gonna happen in the next issue? Next issue is 10 years later, and Peter, he's now working for Reed Richards. Him and Gwen Stacy, they have this loving relationship with each other, and really like all the important discussions that should have happened after that big reveal, all the important things that should have happened after what we just saw at the end of that first issue, they didn't happen. And at the end of that very first issue, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I can't wait to see where this goes. And then in issue 2, I realized, oh, this is where it's going. Just random moments in time. Which, you know, they're pretty good random moments. Chip Zdarsky can write a really good moment in there. He's a very talented writer, but yeah, this is kind of like me just going up to a Baskin Robbins and going, yeah, let me just get a sample of that right there. Oh, 1960s. Yeah, okay, let me get a sample of that right there. Oh, 1980s. Oh, yeah, a lot of different flavors in that one. Okay, all right, yeah. And then I don't get to eat any actual ice cream. I just get to eat the little tiny serving sample spoons, don't get the actual big cone in there. That's what this entire series felt like to me. It felt like there is something great here. It felt like what I heard everybody out there saying about how this is one of the best stories of the entire year. It's one of the best Spider-Man stories I've ever read. I kept looking at this thing going, that thing you're describing, it's there. But what I'm reading is this, and the thing that I feel like everyone's describing is this. But we don't get everything past here. We only get this. And then we move on down the line, way past all this stuff, and then we get this. Yeah, I feel like there's something great in here, but this should not have been one issue per decade. This should have been a big, crazy, experimental miniseries where you get like 4 issues every single decade. And I know that would end up creating like 24 issues. And that would be this big, massive, crazy thing. I'd sit around for some big, massive, crazy thing. I mean, Spider-Man is big right now. Spider-Man is huge in the comics. Spider-Man is to Marvel what Batman is to DC. Not to those limits, not exactly, but he's the best comparison that we have right now. Where they're just like, yeah, create another Spider-Man series out there. Get another Spider-Man miniseries out there. Just keep putting these things out there. And yeah, I think that if you were going to try and do something this crazy and experimental, this would be the time to do it, because you could actually write as much as you would possibly need to write in order to tell the story that you need to tell. But we didn't really get the opportunity to do that, and it is a little bit disappointing. But I will say, to Chip Zdarsky's credit, he did actually try to take a lot of things that he set up in these issues that he did not get a chance to really flesh out, and he did try and find ways to bring them back around in later issues. For example, Norman Osborn at the end of the very first issue, we do see him realizing that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Don't really get anything about that in the 70s or in the 80s, but then in the 90s, when they had to bring him back for the Clone Saga, it does get revealed, okay, so that thing that happened at the end of the 60s issue, that did come back around for this, that explains why Norman Osborn is wrapped up in this whole clone thing. Okay, alright, you actually brought that back around, that's alright. But there are other times where it doesn't really work, like at the end of the 80s issue, they had to combine the Venom thing with Kraven's Last Hunt, so what they did is at the very end of that issue, Kraven ends up becoming Venom. And we don't see anything of that in the 90s issue, or in the 2000s issue. But then in the 2010s issue, all of a sudden, Kraven Venom pops up. And you just look at that and go, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm glad that I'm out of something. I'm glad you're here. I mean, otherwise that would have been just something that you set up and didn't do anything with, but yeah, it's not really important at all to this. I mean, Venom does come back in a way in the very last couple of pages of that final issue. That actually is good. It actually does come back in a way that makes me look at it and go, okay, you know what, that kind of like ties back around to Peter Parker's relationship with Venom and the symbiote itself, and it's kind of like a nice little moment in there. I actually kind of appreciated that. But the whole Kraven thing, it doesn't really matter. Like, there's no reason for Kraven to be Venom in here unless you were going to flesh that out and you were going to explore that, and it's not explored in any way, shape, or form. But I'm not really blaming him, because with this structure of one book per decade, there's no time to explore any of that. And there's a lot of moments in this story that are supposed to have a big emotional impact on the reader that I honestly felt nothing for. Because, honestly, we didn't get the time with these characters to have the emotional connection to them that I needed to have these big moments. For example, Peter Parker gets together with Mary Jane after Gwen Stacy dies, just like he did in the regular universe. But in the regular universe, we got to see that relationship grow. Here, we see him just being completely heartbroken over Gwen Stacy. Then we skip ahead by a decade, and he's with Mary Jane. And now we only see like the low points in their relationships. We see the all is lost moments in their relationship, the troubled moments in their relationship. So while I look at Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker in this storyline and be like, oh yeah, they actually did really care about each other, I look at Peter Parker with Mary Jane in this universe just like, oh man, you never wanted to be together with Mary Jane. She was always just like, I don't know, the emotional rebound that you need after Gwen Stacy. That's not at all how I feel about them in the regular universe, but because we always see him kind of being miserable after getting together with Mary Jane, that's really the way that relationship comes across in this particular book. Or for example, when we get to the 2000s, we've got Spider-Man in New York fighting in the superhero Civil War, but then back home, Spider-Man and Mary Jane, they had 2 kids together, and they're now grown adults at this point in time, but they're now being hunted down by Moreland. And at the end of this thing, Moreland is defeated, but looks like Peter Parker's son has died. And Peter Parker's daughter is holding her brother in her arms. It's like, no! I don't even know that kid's name. I felt nothing in that moment. Like, so? The only character in here I actually have some kind of a connection to is Peter Parker, because he's the only one we've actually gotten to spend time with. He's off in New York. He doesn't even know what's happening to his kid right now. We never even see his reaction to what happened to his son in here. So we've got the sister, who I don't know anything about at all and have no connection to, getting all upset over the loss of her brother, who I know even less about in here. So yeah, it didn't really mean anything to me at all in that moment. But then we get to the 2010s, and his son is fine. He's got like a limp. He's got like a cane that he has to use, but he's totally fine. So then that didn't even matter at all. Like, the emotional impact that I didn't get from that, but was supposed to get, turns out I wasn't supposed to get it at all in the first place. You were just presenting fake emotional impact, and that didn't even work. Yeah, it's... Oh man, I hate saying this, but I really like Chip Zdarsky. I really do. And I think that there is a brilliant story they could have written in here. But aside from a few moments, most of which I will admit came in the final issue, I got no emotional impact out of this. And the only emotional impact I got out of that final issue, it was basically just from Peter Parker being Peter Parker, and not even the Peter Parker that I had seen in this storyline, but from being the Peter Parker that I knew from the regular universe. So it wasn't even really the emotional connection that I had to this version of Peter Parker, it was the emotional connection that I had to the regular Peter Parker from the regular comics, and just me being able to see him in this moment in the final issue that made me go, oh, okay, cool, yeah, I can actually connect now, sort of this. Not saying that like I can't connect to a different version of Peter Parker, but when you don't give me the time to see that character grow, to connect to him, you only give me the snapshots, yeah, it's not really a lot that I'm going to be able to form with this character. Yeah, it's a shame. It is a real shame because there is such a great idea here. And as I said, a lot of people love this. A lot of people absolutely love this book. But I think that is a brilliant idea that just did not get the execution it needed. And that is not the fault of the writer. It's just the fault of the fact that it is one issue per decade. And that is way too big of a task for anybody to successfully be able to pull off. But I will say I hope that this book spawns something from this. Because we were streaming over on Twitch and someone in the chat actually mentioned that Spider-Man Life Story made me realize that regular Marvel and DC are stagnant. And I said that's exactly what I've been saying for years now. I opened this thing up by saying, yeah, it's kind of hard for me to get connected to the characters in Marvel and DC right now when I know that they're gonna be exactly the same in a couple of years. None of this stuff is really going to add up to anything. Peter Parker is never going to age past a certain point. But now I think that a lot of people are looking at this book and they're falling in love with it, not necessarily because of the execution, but just because the premise of this is something that the comic book industry, especially Marvel and DC, have been lacking for so long. The idea of growth and development and aging and progressing and how that's actually important to a character's overall journey. I think that this book did make a lot of people realize I kind of want that. And I think that's where a lot of the praise for this book is actually coming from. It's not so much from people looking at this book and going, this is great. It's from people looking at this and going, I want this. Do this. And I've been wondering about this for a while because I've been saying that with the way that Marvel wants to really kind of represent the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I've been saying for a while, they're going to eventually have to discuss what that means. They're going to have to see how far they're willing to take that. Because as we saw in Avengers Endgame, spoiler alert, they did not come in here at the end and say, yes, Tony Stark miraculously got young again. And now he's de-aged by 10 years and we can do that all over again. Captain America, he's gonna be here forever. No, Tony Stark's gone. He had a family. He's out of here. And then you've got over there, Captain America. He's old now. He's handing that off to Sam Wilson. So we're actually getting a next generation of heroes in here. And hey, look at Spider-Verse! Freaking Spider-Verse, the most critically acclaimed superhero movie. Well, I don't know, Endgame is about there in terms of like critical praise. But yeah, like one of the most critically acclaimed superhero films of all time, definitely the most critically acclaimed Spider-Man film of all time. People love that film, and it gave us probably the best version of Peter Parker we've ever gotten. A guy in his 30s who has gone through some stuff and has the knowledge that going through that stuff gives you with age. We like that, and we want to see more of that. And I'm thinking that now that we've actually had a book like this, we have a lot of people out there who are going, oh, I've now gotten a taste for that. And I want more of it. I want to see that happening in the main universe. And as I mentioned, with the Marvel Comics constantly trying to go, okay, what's going on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Let's stop and think about that for a second. Kamala Khan is going to be introduced in like 2 years over on Disney Plus with her own show. Kamala Khan has been 16-year-old for, what, 5 years now in the Marvel Comics? The actress they hire to play Kamala Khan in the TV show, she's not going to not age. She's going to age. She's going to graduate high school. She's going to go on to college. She's going to graduate college. She's going to go on past that to do other things. She might end up eventually in the Marvel Cinematic Universe just going, yeah, I'm like 25 now, and I'm still calling myself Miss Marvel. It's about time I became Captain Marvel. Like, the Marvel comics are going to have to eventually look at this and just go, all right, what are we going to do with these characters? Like, the thing that is so much more popular than our comics, that is being based off our comics, has characters who, because they're real people, are forced to age and grow and develop. We might have to start doing that in the comics, and it's what I've been wanting for a long time. So if this issue could be like the thing that tests the water on that gets people just praising that idea in comic form, great. I know that I myself thought this book was just okay, but if it can finally get that discussion going, if it can get people asking for that, fantastic. That's all I've ever wanted. Great, let's do it. But thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of Comic Class. Let me know what you thought about Spider-Man Life Story in the comments down below. And if you want to see more comic book videos or our movie review show that we do on the weekends, then make sure that you click that subscribe button and ring that bell so that you get all the notifications. And you can always follow me around the internet on Twitter and Twitch at Professor Thorgy. And next week, ooh, we got something special planned for you. Because next week, we're in October, which means that we're in our month-long celebration of everything spooky and scary from the world of pop culture. So come back next week for the start of Thorgy-ween. For anybody who's new here and hasn't been here for a year, it's fun. It's a thing that we do every single year. It's actually like a kind of a big deal on this channel. I know the name Thorgy-ween does not imply anything important, but it's something that we look forward to. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. Come in next time. Bye.